Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I hope you're doing exceptionally well today. This is the third and final in the three-part series where I've broken down taking a League of Legends skin concept from the very early idea stages to thumbnailing, to composition, to final concept design. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the final render. I don't think I'll ever finish this project. I maybe got like a fifth of the way into fully rendering the illustration, and I just lost passion for the project. I spent a lot of time working on other things over my winter break from college, and I'm getting ready to go back to class in the next couple days, and I just haven't had as much interest in League. I've been spending a lot more time in Hollow Knight Silksong, and because of that, I've been, a lot more drawn to work on art from that game. I have done a couple illustrations of the endings from Hollow Knight Silksong, and you can look forward to a few videos in my next series over the next month or so where I talk about how I did those and maybe discuss a little bit of my interest in Hollow Knight and why I call it my favorite game. I also want to make a short series on sculpting Hollow Knight figures out of clay, where I break down my process for sculpting from creating the designs traditionally and then in 2D and then bringing them into 3D and then possibly even molding and casting. So those are my two next big plans that you can look forward to on this channel. All right, let's jump into the time lapse and I'll talk about what I'm doing. All right, so this first section here is really just taking the composition to get like a very detailed line art. So first I wanted to improve the anatomical accuracy of the composition before I started even drawing the costume. So this first little bit here is just repositioning and rescaling different parts of the body, as well as giving form lines and creating a more in-depth muscular structure, a more accurate muscular structure for the figure. The form lines just give me more information so that the costume can more properly follow the contour of the figure. Spending a lot of time here to go in detail and kind of try to explain the texture of different types of fabric or materials in the clothing. I referenced a few different books on figure drawing while I was doing the anatomy, just to be as accurate as I could. And then I wanted to focus on using some line weight to help me define where shadows and darkness would be as I went into the coloring phase. I really relied on my composition, just drawing over that, selecting and moving different portions of the figure, scaling them up if they seemed a little off. Doing a lot of drawing through or like wireframe, where you do a lot of overlapping lines to show you what the forms are underneath. And then once I had a good base drawing with a lot of detail into it, then I just went into color, just doing a flat, very clean coloring, and then using clipping masks over that to add each of the other colors. And then still using clipping masks, I used a multiply layer and an add layer to just block in a lighting scenario that I thought would be kind of dynamic and fit in with the original background of the composition. After that, I merged the clipping mask for the clothing and the clothing's color profiles with the shadow layer, and then selected different areas and used gradient maps to further select my color profiles for those. Like the skin is a gradient map that I made and tweaked just little by little until it was something that I liked. I think using gradient maps in selected areas, especially with clipping masks, makes the workflow a lot easier, because if you have just one clean base color, you can do everything on top of that and not have to spend time cleaning up your edges. It's very effective. Um, I'm just blocking in a few more colors just with my brush to give me a starting point when I go to render. I can just color pick out of this more detailed composition. And moving on to the background here, I'm just blocking in the very like decoupage, like layered paper kind of designs where I wanted to just have it get progressively darker as it came to the foreground, and then using a little bit of a lighter color to add an edge to each of those different layers of shadow so that it looks like they're catching the light of the background. You know, it looks like they're layers because you have a little bit of a highlight and a little bit of the shadow on the edge of each layer as it moves backwards. So it looks like they're stacked on top of each other. It's just a really simple way to do that. And then once I felt confident in my background, I was working on the foreground components, which is like these swirling ribbons that you see in a lot of the Mythmaker skin splash arts. I used a symmetry to like a symmetry modifier to create a shape, and then duplicated the shape and used the distort form tool to just move it around and kind of let those snowflake like designs swirl through the piece. I think that's a really handy way to get symmetrical objects throughout the piece. All right, so moving on to the more complex rendering. I started with the face since that's the main focal point, and I did a lot of cross-referencing Mythmaker skin splash arts as well as Fiora's other splash arts to get like a really good idea visually of what her facial structure was like and how other splash artists for League of Legends rendered skin. So this is just this like complex rendering where you put a lot of time and attention into every brush stroke and detail, having it look as realistic but stylized as you possibly can. Just takes a lot of back and forth work. I think I'm happy with the result of the portrait aspect, like the facial portion of this figure, but I feel like looking at it now, I haven't worked on this illustration in a little while. So looking back on it, I see a lot of things wrong with it, but at the time I was really proud of how detailed I was able to render this face. The main thing here was creating a soft lineless lighting. So usually when I render, I use like kind of a false line art where I'll take the line art and paint over it and then use values and different hues to put a line art in the illustration where it's like just where I want extra definition, I'll put lines in. League of Legends splash artists don't do that. It's all lineless, like just using your light shapes to define the structure of the forms. So that was a challenge for me since I don't usually render in that style. So it took me a lot of time to get my shadow and light shapes correct enough to define like the bridge of the nose and the chin and the lips and those things. Once I felt like I had the face in a good place, then I started working on rendering the hair, which also took me a very long time. I had to adjust in the same way to rendering hair in a lineless style. I think what I figured out about rendering hair that way is to just think of it as like ribbons and render it accordingly, as if you had a bunch of shiny ribbons together rather than block shapes. Giving it the hair texture is a little hard with outlines. It's difficult to give the hair texture in big shapes. So breaking it up into smaller ribbons and then adding flowing hairs on the ends of those ribbons or overlapping each other with little strands of hair catching light, I think gave a good impression of a realistic but stylized hair. Once I got the bangs and the head hair done, I switched over to working on the ponytail, and I kind of had an idea of how to render the ponytail once I'd done the other portion of the hair, so it went by pretty quickly. Just kind of starting with a base color for my highlights and shadows, and then keeping the values for highlights and shadows separate, slowly building up darker and lighter portions of each of those. So it's almost like you render out the shadows and highlights completely independently of each other, where you have a whole scale of like a whole gradient scale for highlights and a whole gradient scale for shadows, and none of those values overlap. So your darkest shadow or your darkest highlight is lighter than your lightest shadow. That way you can always, when looking at a piece, see where your shapes are, where your highlight is and where your shadow is. Because if you have overlap, everything just kind of gets muddled together and it's hard to tell what the lighting scenario is at all. Once I finished the ponytail, I started working on rendering some of the armor. And I did that by creating a base red color and shaping that, and then doing a clipping mask over the base red where I did the same kind of shadow and highlight sections. You can see here I'm kind of toggling my layers on and off to create specific shapes for the shadows and highlights, and then going through and using my shadow highlight gradients within their respective values to like render out little by little, just building up. Like for the shadows in the armor, I would start by working in the subtle, like swirling patterns in the armor, and then just progressively get lighter and lighter to make that patterning more prominent. I ended up repainting the patterning in the shoulder pauldrons multiple times because I could never get it to quite look right. I think looking back now, this shoulder pauldron is the angle that we're looking at it kind of changes from the top to the bottom, where the top looks like you're kind of looking at it at 3/4 and the bottom it looks like you're looking at it more from the front on. So it's kind of got a wonky, the rendering was difficult because the shape of it looks like it's changing perspective. That's just poor design. If I were to go back and keep working on this and try and re-render that, I think I would first just entirely redesign that pauldron so it has a more clear direction. But once I got feeling good about the pauldron's red color, then I just created a base layer for the gold, and then did a highlight and shadow, and then clipping mask on top of that to do like the engraving in the metal. I did a big layer for all the gold, where I did all the gold flat tone at once, just to give me a good starting point for rendering all of the gold components of the clothing and armor. I think I stopped right after I had blocked in like the value shapes for the armor. I didn't go into the engraving. I don't know if I think it's hard to stick with a piece when you render it so split up like I did here. I did kind of each area one at a time, each color zone one at a time. I think it may be better to work on the piece as a whole little by little. Maybe you slowly render each thing a little more instead of doing things one at a time, because it's very hard to see progress when you spend like an hour and a half just rendering some trim on the armor. So if I were to give some advice or to anyone or to myself, would be to work on all of the colors at once. I wanted to try a different workflow because I had seen a lot of League of Legends illustrators using a similar workflow with the base colors and then rendering each component one at a time. I much prefer single layer painting. Almost all of the paintings that I do, I only use like 2 or 3 layers. And I think that helps create a more cohesive design. So if I do ever come back to this, I'll probably start at my compositional phase and then repaint in a few layers. Maybe one for the background, foreground, and 1 or 2 for the character. And just see how well rendered I can get it. And if I can keep myself interested and motivated to work on it using that method. Well, that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to talk about with this time lapse. And I hope you found some useful information, or at the very least were entertained by my ramblings. Well, I hope to see you all in my next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I love you all. Please take care.